In the end, you're going to have to trust me. Those words, spoken by Raymond Burr as the indomitable Perry Mason, didn't just belong to a fictional defense attorney. They became a mantra for one of television's most influential dramas. Perry Mason wasn't just a courtroom drama, it was a revolution in television storytelling. Behind the crisp suits, the dramatic cross-examinations, and the comforting formula of Mason always wins lay a production filled with chaos, casting fights, studio politics, and unexpected cultural impact. What audiences never knew is that Perry Mason hid dangerous stunts, brutal production schedules, backstage battles, and cultural breakthroughs that forever changed television law. Today we're uncovering 20 weird facts about Perry Mason that will shock even die-hard fans. And yes, there's a bonus fact at the end, one you'll never see coming. Let's step into court. The truth is waiting. Raymond Burr wasn't the first choice. Raymond Burr became synonymous with Perry Mason, but originally, he wasn't even on the studio's shortlist. CBS wanted Mason to be younger, leaner, and more conventionally leading man handsome. Names like Fred MacMurray and Richard Carlson floated around in casting talks. Burr only got an audition because he was suggested for the villain, Hamilton Burger. But when producer Gail Patrick Jackson watched his screen test, she said, "He filled the screen." He was Mason. It wasn't his looks, it was his gravitas. Burr's commanding presence shifted the entire direction of the show. What was meant to be a standard crime procedural suddenly had weight, depth, and moral gravity. Burr didn't just play Mason, he transformed him into an archetype. Audiences didn't want a pretty lawyer, they wanted a force of nature. The cast worked on brutal schedules. Behind the polished courtroom scenes was chaos. The cast filmed nearly 39 episodes a year during the early seasons. That's an almost unthinkable schedule by today's standards. Call sheets demanded 12-hour shooting days, often 6 days a week. Burr, in particular, bore the heaviest load. He was in almost every scene, memorizing mountains of legal dialogue. To make things worse, his health was poor even then. He battled obesity and pain from old injuries. The production didn't slow down. They pushed through, sometimes filming 2 episodes simultaneously. Crew members joked the courtroom set was a prison cell because they practically lived in it. The brutal pace paid off in ratings, but it exacted a toll. By the end of each season, Burr and his castmates looked exhausted on screen, not from acting, but from sheer physical strain. Barbara Hale nearly quit before the show began. Barbara Hale, who played Mason's loyal secretary Della Street, almost didn't take the role. At the time, Hale had a modest film career, but television felt like a step down. Friends warned her that being tied to a weekly show would kill her chances at movies. But when Burr signed on, Hale reconsidered. She later admitted, "I didn't want to play just a secretary, but I knew with Raymond, Della would matter." And she was right. Della wasn't just a typist, she was Mason's confidant, strategist, and quiet moral compass. Hale's decision changed her life. She won an Emmy for the role, worked steadily for decades, and became one of television's first examples of a strong female professional. Ironically, what Hale feared would trap her instead immortalized her. Burr hid a secret on set. Raymond Burr carefully cultivated his public image, but behind the scenes, he carried secrets. Burr told the press he had been married and widowed twice, even claiming he lost a child. In reality, none of it was true. Colleagues on Perry Mason quietly suspected his stories didn't add up, but they respected his privacy. Burr was in fact a deeply closeted gay man at a time when exposure would have ended his career. His relationships were kept hidden, and the false backstory was a shield. On set, this secrecy created tension. He avoided cast gatherings, kept to himself, and controlled his public narrative obsessively. What audiences saw was a stoic, morally unshakable lawyer. What his colleagues knew was a man constantly protecting himself from exposure. Perry Mason wasn't just a role, it was Raymond Burr's armor. The show defied the real courtroom system. Audiences loved Perry Mason's dramatic courtroom reveals, witnesses breaking down, surprise confessions mid-trial, the judge hammering for order. But real lawyers scoffed. In reality, trials don't work that way. Defenders don't usually spring shocking evidence at the last minute. And confession under pressure? Rare. Legal experts noted that Perry Mason created completely unrealistic expectations for jurors and defendants. The show's formula was so powerful that actual lawyers complained jurors entered courtrooms expecting a Mason moment. Some even called it the Perry Mason effect. Judges worried it undermined real legal procedures. Not fiction, but fantasy disguised as reality. And yet, the irony is this. Law schools reported students were inspired by the show. Unrealistic or not, Perry Mason sparked real-world legal careers. That strange contradiction, unreal in court, but real in impact, made it unlike anything else on TV. The courtroom set was a nightmare to film. The iconic courtroom looked impressive on screen, but in reality, it was a logistical headache. The set was cramped, with massive cameras squeezed into narrow aisles between the jury box and judge's bench. Heat from studio lights turned the space into an oven, and actors often sweated through their costumes. Burr had to sit for hours under heavy suits while delivering monologues that stretched pages. Crew members recalled constantly tripping over cables and struggling to move dolly tracks for sweeping shots. Worse, sound. Problems plagued the set. Echoes from the hard wooden surfaces ruined takes. To fix this, production sometimes lined the walls with blankets or padded the benches. Ironically, what looked like order and precision on TV was, behind the scenes, chaos and discomfort. The courtroom wasn't a temple of justice, it was a furnace and a trap. Guest stars were a who's who of Hollywood. One of Perry Mason's strangest legacies is its roster of guest stars. Before they were famous, actors like Burt Reynolds, Robert Redford, and even future Batman Adam West appeared on the show. Some came back multiple times, playing different defendants or witnesses. Fans joked that Los Angeles must have been the murder capital of the world, with the same faces constantly under suspicion. For many actors, Perry Mason was a rite of passage. If you wanted to be taken seriously in Hollywood, you did an episode. The casting directors intentionally pulled from rising talent pools, betting that fresh faces brought authenticity. It worked. Viewers never tired of new villains or victims. Looking back, those episodes feel like a time capsule of Hollywood in transition. Future legends cutting their teeth under Raymond Burr's relentless cross-examinations. William Talman's career nearly ended in scandal. William Talman, who played District Attorney Hamilton Berger, faced his own real-life courtroom drama. In 1960, Talman was arrested during a raid at a private party where police alleged indecent conduct. In an era of moral panic, CBS immediately fired him, even though charges were later dropped. The network claimed his behavior was inconsistent with their family values. Burr and Hale lobbied hard for his return, telling producers the show wasn't the same without him. Eventually, public support and the cast's loyalty got Talman reinstated, but the stigma lingered. Talman later became the first major Hollywood actor to film anti-smoking commercials after being diagnosed with lung cancer. His story showed the double life many actors had to live, one where a slip in personal conduct could end a career overnight. The show was filmed in record time. Despite being dialogue-heavy and complex, each episode of Perry Mason was filmed in just 6 to 7 days. Directors ran the set like a military operation. Burr's scenes were shot first, since his schedule was the tightest, and insert shots, like courtroom close-ups, were often reused from previous episodes. This efficiency meant fewer retakes, even if actors flubbed minor lines. Sometimes, courtroom spectators in the background were cardboard cutouts, used to fill empty jury seats when extras weren't available. The breakneck pace forced creativity. Dailies were rarely reviewed in detail. They trusted the formula to carry them through. What audiences thought was meticulous drama was actually a rapid-fire assembly line. Not perfection, but momentum. The show's polished veneer was a triumph of speed over luxury. Raymond Burr secretly supported the crew. By the late 1950s, Burr was already making substantial money, but he quietly funneled much of it back to the cast and crew. When extras couldn't afford meals, Burr paid for them. When a crew member's child needed medical treatment, Burr covered the bills. He also regularly bought Christmas gifts for every worker on set, from grips to secretaries. He never advertised this generosity, but word spread. Hale later said, "Ray was a rock, not just on screen, but in life." That kindness built fierce loyalty. The cast would defend him publicly, even when rumors swirled about his private life. The irony: while Mason defended fictional underdogs in court, Burr was defending the real ones behind the camera. And before we move on to the next set of facts, go ahead and like and subscribe, because the next revelation shows just how close Perry Mason came to collapse. The show nearly got canceled after season 1. What audiences don't realize is that Perry Mason almost didn't survive its freshman year. CBS executives were nervous about the format. A lawyer who always wins, complex legal dialogue, and a slow courtroom structure seemed like ratings poison. They worried viewers wanted action, not arguments. Midway through the first season, internal memos even suggested pulling the plug. But then the Nielsen numbers came in. Ratings skyrocketed after a few key episodes, and critics began praising the show's intelligence. CBS reversed course almost overnight, doubling down on Burr and his cast. What was once considered too cerebral suddenly became a cultural phenomenon. The irony? The very elements the network thought would sink it, long speeches, legal jargon, and moral certainty, were exactly what audiences craved. Perry Mason didn't just survive, it dominated. Gail Patrick Jackson was Hollywood's hidden power. The woman behind Perry Mason wasn't in front of the camera, but in the producer's chair. Gail Patrick Jackson, a former actress known for her roles in 1930s screwball comedies, became one of the first female executive producers in Hollywood. She ran the show with precision, overseeing scripts, casting, and production decisions. Patrick was fiercely protective of the Mason formula, clashing with CBS when they pushed for changes. She insisted the show remain faithful to early Stanley Gardner's original novels, even when it made episodes harder to write. Her presence was groundbreaking. At a time when women were shut out of executive positions, Patrick wielded authority with a steel hand. She wasn't just producing a TV show, she was proving that women could command respect in one of the toughest boys' clubs in America. The famous theme song was an accident. The dramatic opening music, Park Avenue Beat, is instantly recognizable. But composer Fred Steiner originally wrote it for a different kind of show. CBS wanted something refined, classical, and serious. Steiner turned in a jazz-inspired piece with pounding drums and brass. Executives balked, saying it sounded more like a cop show than a courtroom drama. But Burr loved it. He argued it gave Mason swagger, making him feel like both lawyer and detective. The network relented. The result? One of TV's most iconic themes. What was supposed to be a mismatch became a perfect fit. The song's energy told audiences this wasn't a dry legal lecture. It was a battle. Every time those notes played, you knew justice was about to be won. Burr's health-forced production tricks. As the seasons dragged on, Raymond Burr's health issues grew worse. His weight ballooned, and he struggled with mobility. Producers quietly adapted. Courtroom scenes were blocked so that Burr could remain seated as much as possible, with camera angles hiding his discomfort. When walking shots were unavoidable, directors used doubles or filmed from the waist up. Sometimes Burr would film his close-ups separately, while the rest of the cast performed with a stand-in reading Mason's lines. Viewers at home never noticed. They saw a commanding lawyer in full control. In reality, the crew was working overtime to protect their star. Burr's health was a constant battle, but instead of ending his career, it forced the production team to innovate. Mason's power wasn't in his stride, it was in his presence. Real lawyers tried to emulate Mason. The influence of Perry Mason didn't stay on TV screens. Real lawyers confessed they tried to copy Mason's courtroom theatrics: intense cross-examinations, dramatic pauses, and sudden revelations. Judges noticed and often warned attorneys that real trials weren't television dramas. One California judge famously told a young lawyer, "This is not a Perry Mason episode. Control yourself." Despite the warnings, the show had real educational impact. Law schools reported surges in applications, especially from women inspired by Della Street's intelligence and competence. The American Bar Association even praised the show for making the law exciting to the public. The irony? While Mason's tactics were pure fiction, his spirit, the pursuit of truth at all costs, did inspire a new generation of attorneys. Perry Mason wasn't real, but his influence on real law was undeniable. Early Stanley Gardner oversaw the scripts. Unlike most TV adaptations, Perry Mason's creator, early Stanley Gardner, kept a tight grip on the series. Gardner, a former lawyer himself, demanded accuracy and constantly sent notes to the writers. If dialogue didn't reflect courtroom procedure, even if dramatized, he'd insist on changes. He was especially protective of Mason's moral core. Mason could bend rules, but never break the law or betray a client. Gardner's involvement sometimes slowed production, but it gave the show credibility. Writers grumbled that his edits were nitpicky, but Burr respected the rigor, calling Gardner Hirm, conscience of the show. The partnership wasn't always smooth, but it ensured Mason wasn't just a television hero. He was, in Gardner's eyes, a guardian of legal ideals. Few authors ever controlled their adaptations this closely, making Perry Mason a rare collaboration between Hollywood and literature. Burr became trapped by the role. Raymond Burr once admitted that Perry Mason was both the best and worst thing to ever happen to him. The role made him a household name, but it also trapped him. Casting directors stopped offering him anything else. He was too strongly identified with Mason's gravitas. Burr wanted to play villains again, like he had in noir films of the 1940s, but Hollywood refused. Even when Perry Mason ended, Burr was pulled back into television with Ironside, another legal-adjacent role. Fans loved it, but Burr privately struggled. He feared he'd never escape Mason's shadow. Ironically, he played Mason for so long that audiences began confusing the actor with the character. Burr wasn't just acting a lawyer. To millions, he was a lawyer. The line between man and role blurred until it consumed his career. Episodes were banned in some countries. Though it seems tame today, Perry Mason was too much for certain foreign broadcasters. In conservative markets like South Africa and parts of Latin America, episodes were sometimes banned for portraying corrupt officials, adultery, or women defying authority. The courtroom scenes where Mason dismantled police officers or prosecutors were considered subversive. Some governments worried the show undermined respect for the justice system. In South Africa, authorities cut entire episodes where racial themes surfaced, even subtly. For American audiences, Mason was a champion of fairness. Abroad, he was sometimes seen as dangerous. What was ordinary TV drama in the US became political dynamite elsewhere. The irony? While Hollywood intended Mason to entertain, he occasionally served as a quiet act of resistance in places where truth itself was on trial. The show had an unwritten rule: Mason never lost. One of the strangest things about Perry Mason is that Mason almost never lost a case. Out of 271 episodes, he officially loses just once, and even that loss was later reversed. CBS executives worried audiences would lose faith in Mason if he failed. Early Stanley Gardner agreed, insisting Mason must always triumph, because the stories weren't about the possibility of defeat, but the process of unmasking the guilty. Writers sometimes pushed back, arguing it made the show predictable, but Gardner and Burr were adamant. Mason was truth incarnate, not just another lawyer. This rule gave the show a mythical quality. Audiences tuned in not to wonder if Mason would win, but how he'd do it. The courtroom became less about realism and more about ritual, a morality play staged every week. The series created a real Mason effect on juries. The cultural impact of Perry Mason ran deeper than entertainment. Legal scholars coined the term the Perry Mason effect, to describe how jurors expected dramatic confessions and airtight proof in real trials. Prosecutors complained that jurors grew skeptical without smoking gun evidence, while defense lawyers said clients demanded Mason-style theatrics. Judges worried the show warped public understanding of justice. The effect lingered for decades, shaping how Americans viewed the courtroom. Even in the 1980s, lawyers reported clients asking if their cases would get a Mason moment. The irony is sharp. A TV show built on formula and fiction ended up altering the psychology of real juries. Mason didn't just win cases on television, he changed how millions believed justice should unfold in real life. Burr's last case was off-screen. Here's the twist no one saw coming. When Raymond Burr was dying of cancer in the early 1990s, he insisted on filming several final Perry Mason TV movies despite being gravely ill. What fans didn't know is that he used those paychecks to quietly set up scholarships for law students and fund children's hospitals. Burr never told the press. It wasn't publicity, it was legacy. Just as Perry Mason always fought for the innocent, Burr ensured his last acts would defend the vulnerable. The man who spent decades pretending to deliver justice on screen left behind real-world justice off-screen. Not fiction, but truth. Perry Mason wasn't just a TV show, it was a cultural earthquake, reshaping television drama, inspiring careers, and even altering courtroom behavior. What began as a risky legal series became an immortal icon of justice. And in the end, maybe that's the strangest fact of all. Perry Mason blurred the line between law and legend until one became the other. If you loved uncovering these secrets, hit like, subscribe, and step back into court with us next time. Because the truth is always waiting.